Good morning. I am delighted to be here with you again this morning to hear the word, share the word, and to worship God. Won't you pray with me? God, here we are again. Here we are again, O God, ready for a word to enliven us. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. The lectionary text this morning takes us to the story of Jacob. Jacob is a sorry individual. Jacob has swindled his brother and, with his mother's help, deceived and manipulated his blind father. This manipulation and deception was in order that he could receive the blessing of the firstborn that rightfully belonged to his brother Esau. Jacob's actions had forced him to become a fugitive, running away from Esau, who was going to kill him. Earlier in the story, while deceiving his father, who thought he was his brother Esau, his father had asked Jacob how he found game and returned so quickly to make a meal. Jacob's reply to his father, Isaac, is very telling, because here's what he said: "Because the Lord, your God, granted me success." Jacob had no awareness of God or that God was aware of him until his Bethel experience. He arrived at this place on his journey alone, with no one to welcome him and no one to offer him hospitality. And it is here, in this place, note, while Jacob was asleep, when he had let down his guard, when he wasn't being manipulative or deceptive, when he was most vulnerable, that he became aware of the presence of God. In Jacob's circumstances of estrangement, fear, and guilt, Jacob unexpectedly encounters God. God is with Jacob where he is. And this schemer, this manipulator, this deceiver becomes a worshiper at that place, marking the site as a sacred place. God had been with Jacob all along. What he said was, "God, I never knew you were here," but God had been with Jacob all along. Why was God's presence a surprise to Jacob? Jacob said, "Surely the Lord was in this place and I did not know it." Could it be that given how Jacob had lived, he didn't want to know God? Someone describes Jacob as the sort of man who has you checking to be sure your wallet is still there after he passes you. And yet Jacob, this unsavory character, is visited by God in a dream while he's sleeping on a rock in this place. The Bible presents dreams here and elsewhere as a medium for direct communications from God. They come unasked for as gifts beyond any control, and dreamers usually awake knowing they had been visited and changed by God. When we read texts like this one that focuses on a person and a place and an encounter with God, we want to ask questions. When we read these stories in the Bible where God appears to Jacob and Moses, we want to, at least I do, I always question when I read the Bible, how come? Where is God? How come God appears to them? And when we read these, we yearn for God to show up. We long for God to make a personal appearance to us so that there could be no confusion about what God expects of us. Well, God can and God does appear all the time. The problem for us may be where we're looking. Very often, we are always so busy looking out there somewhere for God and for our Bethel, our house of God, that we miss the one place God's presence seeks to manifest inside of us. Theologian and author Richard Rohr says, we have been given the gift of the divine presence. He says, quote, the gift is objectively already within, and yet has to be desired and awakened by the person. But you never know that it is within until after it is awakened, unquote. The awesome divine presence is already resident in us, awaiting a readiness in us to be encountered. But an encounter with the presence of God can generate fear. That is one of the things pastors don't tell a congregation. When you meet this awesome God, it can generate fear. Jacob's encounter with God surprised and frightened him, causing him to say, how awesome is this place? But it wasn't the place that was awesome. It was the presence of God that Jacob had never experienced before that was awesome. An encounter with the awesome presence of God is going to generate fear for us, as it did for Jacob, for several reasons. First, after the encounter, everything about us will change. After the encounter with the awesome presence within, we will find that our life is no longer our own. Take my word for it. That the ego is no longer in control of dictating what happens in our life. An encounter with the presence will generate fear, because as a result of this encounter, we will be called to higher ground. And frankly, sometimes we're very comfortable with things the way they are. Thank you very much. We don't necessarily want to be called anywhere by God. We may have a desire to experience the awesomeness of God, but we don't really want what comes with that experience. We don't really want God to make any demands on us. We don't want what we consider to be out of control. No, we don't. But what usually comes with an encounter with this awesome presence within is a mission, a task, or we are sent with directions. But we are sent to do and to be God's active living presence in the world. Oftentimes, the mission, the task, or the direction usually is something that may have been sitting dormant in our souls for quite a while. Something we formerly considered near impossible or impossible. But the reality is that the encounter comes with the same promise made to Jacob. It is the promise that God always gives. Know that I am with you and I will keep you wherever you go. An encounter with the presence within will generate fear because it requires us to be known thoroughly and completely by God. This may be the thing that generates the most fear of all. Because if we desire to awaken the divine presence within us, we have to stand naked, without pretense, in front of that crystal clear mirror of God's presence. Jacob is quite a character, and I usually encourage congregations to go back and read that whole chapter, and read before and probably read after. Because you'll find the lectionary was protecting us and didn't tell us the end of that chapter, but at the end of that chapter, Jacob makes 5 conditions with God. He says, God, if you will do this, 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 and this, then you can be my God and I will be your person. What? We are astounded and surprised at the audacity of Jacob to do something like that and to say something like that to God. But most of the time, our usual stance before the God of our being is like that of toddlers playing hide and seek. We cover our eyes and we say to the God of our innermost being, "You can't see me." Really? Theologian Paul Tillich says, quote, "Nobody wants to be known. We do not even wish to be known by ourselves. We may try to hide the depths of our souls from our own eyes. We refuse to be our own witness. How then can we stand the mirror in which nothing can be hidden?" Unquote. Dr. Jeffers explained that I'm also, in my retirement, I'm also a hospital chaplain. I want to tell you that in the rooms in the hospital that I enter, I had better be a clear mirror. I had better be a clear mirror, because most of the times it is tragedy and illness and impending death that makes us want to be clear mirrors. And at those times, as a chaplain walks in the room, you may be a reflection for that person who is struggling with the clearness of their own mirror. Awakening to the presence living within can become a frightening experience for us when we realize there's no hiding place. There's no privacy within our souls. There's no pretending with God about the stuff that really matters, the things that constitutes who we really are, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our imagination, because God is at the very heart of that inside with us. When we look in to this inner presence and we stand before this mirror, clearly, we see ourselves. There's no hiding. There's no pretending in front of God here. When we can conquer our fears and stand in the light of that scrutiny, the fact that God knows us so well, that God knows us inside out, becomes the very source of our great comfort. It is this that forms the basis of our own knowing. Then we become a clear mirror. As clear mirrors, we awaken to the gift of the presence of God within by doing what Jesus the Christ did. We surrender. That's the one thing we don't really want to do. We do not wish to surrender to God. We do not wish to let go and be out of control to God. We want to keep the reins of things. But that's not what Jesus the Christ did. Jesus the Christ surrendered. And as clear mirrors, that's what we will do also. We will surrender. Surrendering to the presence within allows us to live in the awareness of the constant, permeating presence of an awesome God. We will not need to ask, "Where is God?" We will ask instead, "When is God?" Because we will find God in ourselves and ourself in God. That didn't come from me. It was a 16th century nun who said that. We will find God in ourselves and ourself in God. We will find that God is everywhere. Because finding God is not being in the right place. It is allowing the presence of the God who lives in us to be manifested any place we find ourselves. Priest and scientist Pierre de Chardin wrote, "The deeper I descend into myself, the more I find God at the heart of my being." We are made in the image and likeness of God. And if we have the desire and the courage to look within, if we willingly surrender, we will awaken this gift of the presence within us. We are sure at that time to experience the awesomeness of God. It is imperative that we know who we are and whose we are. We are God-bearers. We're God-bearers. We're those who carry the awesome presence of God as a gift to share with the world. The question for us is, what does the incarnational presence looks like in the 21st century? We're not creating anything new. Jesus Christ was the incarnation of God. We are incarnational presence in the 21st century. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, what does that mean to us? And how does that look? And the reason we have to ask and answer the question is because it is a very great challenge for us how we live as the incarnational presence in our world. Our world is very troubled. Our world needs our incarnational presence. And so we need to be asking the question, what does it look like when I live the presence in the world? Our great challenge is to how to live as God-bearers. We are challenged to live in union with God in such a way that being our own witness does not frighten us or bring us to despair. We're challenged to surrender and be held by the presence within in such a way that, like Jesus, all of our actions, not some, but all of our actions are directed by the presence within. When we begin living the presence, we will then become true bringers of God hope to our troubled world. When we begin living the presence, we will always use our moral agency to become a force for God's justice in our world. When we begin living the presence, you and I will become generous dispensers of God's mercy, of God's compassion in our world. When we begin living this presence, when we become clear mirrors and begin living this presence of God in our world, we will live into our humanity, taking responsibility for our actions as moved by the presence within us. When we earnestly desire and awaken to the gift of the divine presence within us, then we will have our own awesome experience with the God of mystery, whose presence can be experienced anytime, anywhere, anyhow, by anyone. Then we will say, God, you were here all along, and we never knew it. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.